Spirituality family. It's been a long time. It's been a great minute. And I wish that I was coming to you with broadcasting of something that was more motivating and uplifting. But I'm not. In this particular episode of Spirituality Podcast, I am going to be reading from my recent journal records of how I experienced racial bias, racial discrimination, and harassment by the hands of an Asian coworker and the organization that I work for. How I was not supported in this particular experience. So first, I just want to welcome you. I want to welcome you again to Spirituality Podcast. I want to welcome you to my reading of my recent journal records of this experience, the experience of how I was brought to the modern day lynching tree by an Asian coworker. And this is records of a Black woman in leadership, So I wanted to just share this with the world. Before I start off, I am Alicia F. Griffin. So great, and so humbly honored for you to be here with me today to just hear about the first chronicle, so to speak, of my experience of how I was brought to the modern day lynching tree by an Asian coworker. And let me start by saying that these events are recent, they're fresh. I feel that one method of fighting against racism in general, and just fighting against discrimination and how white supremacy and white superiority, like what truly does that, what do those terms mean, and how does it really show up? What does Black oppression really feel like? What does that really feel like? And, I never really knew the true definition, the true meaning of what it looks like, sounds like, and feels like until this particular experience. And I feel that one of the methods of fighting against it is educating any form of racism. And by educating, it's just sharing our story. So this is my story. And thank you again for being part of my story here today. Throughout my reading, I will provide keywords and definitions throughout my reading. And this is a little bit more than what's in my written article. I want my story to, like I said, educate and to build capacity. So the first keyword is racial trauma. What is racial trauma? According to the Mental Health America, racial trauma or race-based trauma stress refers to the mental and emotional injury caused by the encounters with racial bias, ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. Any individual that has experienced an emotional, painful, sudden, or uncontrollable racist encounter is at risk of suffering from a race-based traumatic stress injury. In the U.S., Black, Indigenous, people of color are most vulnerable due to living under a system of white supremacy. So here's the beginning of my reading. I thought and prayed long and hard over if I should record the most racially traumatic, demeaning experience in my adult life. I mean, after all, quite honestly, I am not a writer. So I tell myself, no, I am not a writer. And yes, my journal record will have all kinds of typos, grammatical errors, and so forth. But that is me. And why should I really care? Because this is really my story, correct? Correct. So this is me. And who am I? I am a middle-aged mixed race woman. My Filipino was first American generation Filipino. My mother is Black. My parents separated when I was 6 months, and my mother raised me. So due to my exterior color, what I primarily identify, and being raised by a Black mother, I identified as Black most of my life. Even this particular day of the incident, where I was brought to the modern day lynching tree by an Asian coworker. So that's the beginning of my story, the beginning of the article. First, let me explain what a lynching tree symbolizes in the modern day. So the modern day lynching tree symbolizes Black oppression, as well as the most horrific symbol of white supremacy. The lynching tree is where Blacks were reminded of their inferiority and powerlessness, where we were led, yes, to be humiliated and dehumanized, a place where we were brought to our knees in anguish and suffering and fear, a place where every piece of us had been stripped away, where our power was stripped away, our voice, our cries, our pleas were not heard for doing absolutely nothing wrong. A place where we as Black people were unjustly and wrongfully accused and held accountable by white people, whereas the white people, or the oppressors, were not held accountable for their racist actions. The lynching tree is where the only refuge we have is Jesus. And see, I found myself at the foot of the modern day lynching tree by an Asian coworker. And honestly, all I can say is, what a mess. What a mess. What a mess. What a mess. How did I come to this point? 4 months into this new career position with this new organization, 4 months into it, I kid you not, I found myself experiencing microaggressions at the hands of a younger white woman. And that was my first experience after 4 months of experience that. My first experience of microaggressions with this particular young white woman was when I had to oversee people and culture, also known as human resources. Side note. Let's just take a moment right there. Just a side note about people and culture, also known as human resources. And this is why I say people and culture, also known as human resources, because I no longer associate myself with the word human resources, with HR, after attending a very, very well put together diversity and inclusion workshop that explained the history behind human resources. And let me tell you this. As a Black person, human resources, it was and still is nothing human about that history of human resources and how human resources management, like the evolution of it and how it originally originated, right? Slaves. So I'm gonna just give you just a bit of back. We're just gonna take a detour for a second, just so you can just be aware of what human resource management, the historical perspective is, right? Slaves compromise an important source of manpower in almost all of our ancient civilizations, right? They could be sold and purchased like commodities, right? Their main purchasers were the wealthy rulers, landlords, tribal chiefs, and affluent businessmen, right? Influential businessmen, right? The purchaser of slaves had complete control over their slaves. And slaves, our people, took a variety of strenuous duties and jobs, right? Such as carrying heavy loads, rowing ships and boats, construction of buildings and forts, digging canals, tillage of soil and so forth, right? Factory manufacturing type of work, right? Labor intensive work. And their main compensation for their efforts, for their work, for their labor, comprised mainly of food, shelter, and clothing, not monetary, right? The slaves were dealt with iron hands. They were subject to strict supervision and non-compliance of the orders of their masters or supervisors were generally the non-compliance of their orders of their masters or supervisors were generally punishable with physical tortures and occasionally with cutting off their limbs or even death sentence for the grave offenses. So that's the history. I just wanted to take a moment to give a brief history, a historical perspective of how human resource management originated. So from then on, after attending this diversity and inclusion workshop, from then on, I refer to it as human resource as people and culture, also known as PAC, right? So sorry about my about my detour there, but back to my record. So the first experience of microaggression was when I had to send a documented email. Again, I'm in charge of human resources, and there's certain things where certain actions of employees where I need to do my due diligence on my part because it is my primary responsibility to send certain documents and send certain emails. And in response, so I sent this to the younger white woman, and in response, I received a very unprofessional, disrespectful email directly from this white woman. This email attacked me personally. It attacked my role within the organization, and it just screamed microaggression throughout. And this was all for me for doing my job. It was just all for doing my job. It was just me just sending a professional email. I was then obligated, again, due to my position in the organization, to meet with the white woman, the white coworker, as well as with the executive director, who is my report to, and the white woman's director, to discuss the email as well as her needs and her wants and support. Never once was the mannerism or intent of the email addressed by the executive director. Never once was her foul, disrespectful, unprofessional behavior, language, or attitude addressed. She was allowed to continue to verbally disrespect each of us, all people of senior leadership, and that was myself, the executive director, and her director. And I am the only Black person and Black woman in senior leadership. So she was allowed to continue to verbally disrespect us, each of us in that meeting, in a very unprofessional way. What was ironic was that she used her white privilege. It was just evident that she used her white privilege to make sure that her voice was heard in a very offensive, unprofessional, disrespectful way, and was not one time held accountable for the white superiority and the privilege that she displayed. And see, this is the same white woman. This is the same white woman who, the following week, at a diversity, equity, and inclusion, a DEI interactive workshop that was facilitated by external people, verbally accused senior leadership again, which included myself, the executive director, and her director, of white supremacy, and made a comment, and the comment was along the lines of how white supremacy is in leadership and it needs to be addressed. And of course, the three people that she attacked, including myself, we just remained on mute in our Zoom square and didn't say much. And again, in the same meeting, when the group was asked, we were asked to type in the chat about how we are leaving this workshop. So the workshop was based on self-awareness, self-identification, and so forth. just to build capacity, correct? And that was the purpose. But she took this moment to end the workshop in the chat box. She took this moment again to accuse leadership, again, us three, myself, the executive director and the director, of white supremacy in the chat. And I just want to point out, that she was the only white woman in the Zoom room, in the Zoom meeting room. She was the only white woman there. But she used her white privilege to have her voice to make accusations about white supremacy. So do you see where I'm going with that? So it was just so wrong. So shortly after the DEI workshop, the white coworker, the white woman, submitted her resignation. And before her final exit date, what she did is she physically scheduled, because again, we're in COVID, everything's virtual, everything's remote. So she physically scheduled meetings with all of her coworkers that she was close with, which was majority of the staff, to tell her story about why and how she is leaving the organization. And the whole story from start to finish was riddled with all sorts of lies. Lies of us, the leadership team, again, the three core people that I'm just going to refer to as senior leadership was, again, myself, the executive director, and the director. But she accused us of backing her into a corner and forcing her out. This white woman, which is furthest from the truth, very furthest from the truth of how those events went down. And never once did she ever mention how just disrespectful and unprofessional she was in the whole process before she left. But this white woman played victim to the fullest, while we, the senior leadership team, the three core people, had no choice but to take the aftermath of months of unprofessionalism, occupational oppression, microaggressions, and finally it led up to the day in front of the lynching tree for me, right? The day of racial bias, discrimination, and harassment. And on top of all of that, this was all led, the months of aftermath of the unprofessional occupational oppression, and even to the racial bias and discrimination, harassment. On top of all that, that was led by the hands of the Asian coworker, who happened to be close friends to the white woman, and who also, unfortunately, has a seat at the leadership table because she actually manages people. But I had showed this while I was speaking, but let's just take a moment to go over a key definition. It's microaggression. Before I move to the next slide, but microaggression. What is microaggression? Microaggression is a term used for brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards a culturally marginalized group or groups. So that's microaggression. So we had, 4 months into my position, so I'm brand new, basically into my position, I experienced microaggression on 3 or 4 separate occasions by this white woman before she actually quit. And she was never held accountable for any of that, for the insults or for her disrespectfulness or her unprofessionalism. So after the white woman left, the next staff meeting was the first Zoom funeral I ever attended. And I'm going to call it a Zoom funeral because that's what I felt like it was for the white woman, right? And it was led by the white woman's close friend, the Asian coworker. And there were people actually crying that this woman left, that this white woman left. They were actually crying about this, that this woman left. And again, I just want to point out that technically she was the only white woman on our team. And they were like sobbing to the fullest, like just people were just sobbing. It was the saddest, most awkward situation I've ever had, because people were encouraged to speak about her as if she was physically no longer on this earth. That's how bad it was. When in fact she quit willingly. She didn't die. She quit. Like she quit. We didn't force her out. She quit. Right. But this was the very first meeting. I just want to point out, this is the very first meeting that the Asian woman called me out, and this is all staff. So she called me out specifically in front of everyone, like, Alicia, you need to explain yourself and how you handled the situation. I was called out, and I remember thinking about the entitlement and just the privileges of others in this space, including her. This younger Asian woman has the audacity to think that she can use her privilege to make demands of me, for me to explain myself to her for something that it's not her story, it's not her experience, it's not her employee profile. So no, I can't share my explanation for that. And the main explanation is I did my job. But why do I need to explain that to you? Because see, technically, not technically, it's just what it is. She's not my direct report to. And if you look at the organizational chart, she sits underneath me as far as just the level of leadership, right? But even after being called out, even after going through the experience of people crying, and the reason why people were crying in this particular space is because they believed the lies of their fellow former coworker that we, senior leadership, including myself, forced her out. And we had no choice, myself and her direct report to, which was a director, and the executive director, we had no choice but to remain silent and not say a word. And that's what I did. I remained on mute in my little Zoom square, and I left it at that. And then over the course of the next couple of months, I sat in several meetings. I sat in just different types of meetings, all staff meetings where it's all of the staff, leadership meetings where it's just a smaller group of us, but the Asian woman is included in the leadership meeting, again, because she manages people. So she is on the leadership team, and workshops, DEI workshops, or conversations, or just when it's like an open forum type of thing. With the same, I sat there with the same, in all these meetings, I sat there with the same entitlement and privileges from the younger woman. I was again, over the course of the next couple of months, I was again directly called out on 2 other occasions, like, Alicia, you need to explain yourself in front of, and in both of those occasions that I was publicly called out, it was in front of all staff. So I was, and then in all of these meetings, we, the senior leadership team, again, the core 3 of us, we, the leadership team, were always attacked. We were always attacked with accusations of white supremacy. And I just did not understand that. I didn't understand it, none whatsoever, because if anything, she has used and abused her privilege of voice, correct? Where none of us in the senior leadership position, including myself, ever had a voice. We didn't have those same privileges. And I especially did not have those same privileges. What was I saying? So yes, so we were always attacked of white supremacy. We were attacked and accused of distrust. We were accused publicly of hurt, etc., and etc., just because her coworker, the white woman, told everyone that she was forced out by senior leadership. However, not one time did I respond or say anything at any of these meetings. Even when I was called out, I just sat and I was silent. I was just silent, and I just watched and I just listened, and I was just appalled about how the behavior and the actions. But I didn't speak, not once. And not once was this Asian woman held accountable for her behavior, her attacks, her words, her accusations, or her insults. And I remember at one point telling her director, who was also part of the harassment, the public harassment, I remember telling her director, it's as if we're being held accountable. But no one is holding her accountable for her actions. And where's the right in that? Where's the right in that? I mean, let's be clear. Again, I had just started with the company. And before me, her director, that's the same person that's experiencing it with me, her director had started like a month before I did. So we're new into this organization. We're new into the dynamics and the relationships that exist here, and the white supremacy that shows up here, and the white privilege that shows up here, and eventually the racism that shows up here. We're new into it. And our direct report to our direct supervisor was the executive director. And not one time, he is over everyone. And not one time were they held accountable. So let's just take a pause. I don't want to even say pause. And I'll go over that actually in my record, my second record, of why I will no longer say let's take a pause. But let's just take a moment. Let's take a moment because we have another key term, which is white supremacy. So what is white supremacy? White supremacy is a term used to categorize various belief systems, central to which are one or more of the following key tenets. Number one, whites should have dominance over people of their backgrounds, of other backgrounds, especially when they are where they may coexist. So sorry about that. The second is whites should live by themselves in a white-only society. And three, white people have their own culture that is superior to other cultures. 4, white people are genetically superior to other people. And that's white supremacy. Now, again, you're probably asking, well, how is it white supremacy? Because it's saying white people in this, and this is an Asian woman. Correct, it is. But the thing about it is discrimination typically happens at the hands. Yes, it will happen at the hands of white people, but sometimes it happens at the hands of within the same people of color category. Do you understand what I'm saying? So after 2 months of having these meetings, and being publicly verbally harassed and attacked and insulted and accused. After 2 months of it, the finale, the final straw for me, is I think what they say for me, was when we had a follow-up DEI, an interactive workshop facilitated by the same external parties, right, where the white woman had accused leadership 2 times publicly of white supremacy. But so we had a follow-up DEI interactive workshop by external parties. And as the workshop was closing, the facilitators commented on an observation. They observed that there was tension in the room. So that's how bad it was. So they would literally, she would literally create a hostile environment where you can just feel the tension. And this happened at every single meeting, basically, every single meeting. So they made that observation, they commented on it, and then what they did is they tried to create a brave, safe space in the room for people to dialogue, so conversation can start, so restorative practices can begin and talks can begin to address exactly what the tension is. Again, we never knew exactly what the tension was, because out of all the times that we met with this Asian woman to ask, privately, to ask what her needs were, her support was, we had numerous of those private meetings, and she never once can tell us what her needs are. She could, but it wasn't sustainable needs and wants that we can say, oh, well, yeah, we can definitely do that, or we can start to begin doing that, but it was never that. So in the space, they encouraged people to speak up. The Asian woman wasn't the first one to speak up, which is surprising because she usually is. But the Asian woman wasn't the first one to speak up. But when she did, she accused the senior leadership of harming her and others on her team. She specifically has said, a lot of harm has been done and a lot of healing needs to be done. And she began to cry. And this was in front of all staff and as well as external colleagues, external parties. And you knew that, and you felt, and I felt that accusation and allegations were directed specifically at myself, the director, and the executive director in this public forum. And it was embarrassing, and it was very disappointing. Yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that. But now this is where, for me, my frustration did boil over. Because I felt like she used her privilege to come into the space and openly accuse me of harm. See, there's a difference. There's a difference between being harmed and being hurt, right? There's a difference. I come from an abusive household and from my childhood, and I can tell you that trauma is harmful. Trauma is harmful. And in my mind, when you use the word harm, I associate that with trauma. So I wanted to know, how have I caused anyone within this organization any trauma? Because not one time after being verbally attacked, harassed, insulted, disrespected in a very unprofessional way, never once have I said not one word. Not one word in any of those spaces. Not even in this space where I was being accused of harm. I didn't say one word. However, I was accused of harming people in front of the whole staff and external colleagues. 5 days later, we were scheduled for a meeting to discuss restorative practices. Because again, we've had numerous private conversations about how we can try to repair the organization's morale that was decimated by the white woman and continue to be torn down by the hands of the Asian coworker, right? So we were in this space, the leadership team. There were 6 of us, because there's 6 of us on the leadership team in the Zoom space, right? And I was the only black person, the only black woman, again, in senior leadership, on leadership, in the room. And must I remind you, I never once in any of this after being verbally attacked and publicly attacked in these several useless meetings. I never once said anything, but after being openly accused of harming people, I felt compelled to speak. I felt compelled to have a voice in this space. And I thought, well, we're talking about restorative practices. That's the way that the space and the meeting was set up, is to have those talks. And I felt like I should have a voice as well after being witnessing and being on the attacking end of this woman's voice. So for once, I felt like, okay, well, I should have a voice too. And so I felt compelled to speak so that this Asian woman can understand the difference between being harmed and her feelings being hurt because her friend decided to quit. Because that's what the matter was, truthfully. So I spoke my piece about it. And after I spoke my piece, another employee, a white man, I just wanted to point that out, a white man of the leadership team, he chimed in to express his feelings and frustrations as well about having these useless conversations. And he expressed it in a very vocal, unprofessional, uncensored way. Right? And at one point in the conversation, because the conversation kept going, right? And then at one point in the conversation, the Asian woman made it a point to say that she was ready to move on. She was ready to move on, but there was a lot of distrust in leadership, and we need to support each other in leadership. And that's very important to build the trust and to help so we can help each other, help others move on from the situation of the white woman leaving. Again, everyone being told she was forced out. And I thought to myself as I was listening to her, how is that possible? How are you ready to move on? Literally, just last week, she accused us of harming her and her team members in an open public forum. How are you ready to move on? How is that leading your team forward? How is that building trust within leadership? Within this leadership team, right? And these are the questions that I asked her. I openly asked her these questions. How are you ready to move on? I've literally sat through months, more than 2 months, more than 3 months. I've sat through months of just verbal attacks and insults and harassment. So I just want to know, how are you ready to move on? Because all of those insults and attacks were done by you. So, but I didn't say all of that. I just asked the question, like, how are you ready to move on? Like, I don't see it. I don't understand. Like, why would you even say that? How are you ready to move on? And I had to tell her, I followed it with, let's be clear. You, meaning her, right? You literally just accused us of harming you and everyone else in an open forum. Right? So, of course, when the accountability is turned towards her, it's silence. The first time, she's silenced. She has nothing to say. Where's the same energy? Where's the same voice that she used to throw out attacks and allegations for months? Where's that same voice? And quite honestly, I honestly left the meeting completely fine. I was no different. It was no different than the spaces I've been in with her for the past 2 months, right? It was no different. I felt everyone had a voice and they said what they felt that needed to be said within that space. Again, I didn't feel like what I said or my approach was nowhere near. It wasn't even close or rubbing up against. Nowhere near as uncensored and unprofessional as some of the other people who shared in that same space. Well, my feelings were wrong. A couple of days later, after that particular meeting where I spoke up after 2 months of public harassment. And this was the first time I spoke up. A couple of days later, I got a call from the Asian Women's Director, who is the one that also has, experienced the same verbal attacks and harassment publicly. I got a call from her, from the Asian Women's Director, who I consider an ally, that this Asian woman wanted to complain. She wanted to complain about me, about how I approached her in the meeting. She used words such as aggressive, harsh, and I was accused of creating a hostile environment to the point that she was uncomfortable being in the meetings with me. So I just want to just have a side note and just analyze that right quick. All of our meetings are virtual due to COVID, right? All of our meetings are virtual. So I'm just not understanding, how are you uncomfortable coming into a situation, coming into a place where I'm not physically present? I'm like virtually on, like I'm on a camera in my own little separate space, in my own little office. Like, how am I creating hostile environments? And not one time have I even said anything. And the one time I said something, now you want to file a complaint against me. But I remember my immediate response to her director was, and quite honestly, I'm just going to be honest, what I said to her was, you need to tell her to tread very lightly. The words and the allegations are stereotype labeling, it's racial profiling, and it's microaggression. It's downright offensive. There were others in that meeting who were white and were far more unprofessional and uncensored than I was. This is racism. The complaint is fraudulent. In that same meeting with the director, who I consider an ally, I was encouraged. After I had made that statement, I was encouraged to talk to this Asian woman, although she didn't want to talk to me. She didn't want to talk to me because, again, she was distraught, and she was, by my words and my approach, she was distraught. So she didn't want to talk to me, but I was encouraged to talk to her first. And this is after I just made a statement about racism. I declined. I initially, and moving forward for like a month, I declined to even talk to her. And it wasn't because I was angry or upset, because I wasn't. Honestly, I wasn't at that point. It was because the reason why I didn't want to meet with her is because I knew I would not be able to meet her expectations. I wouldn't be able to meet her expectations. And I knew she would come into that meeting with expectations, because for the past few months, she has been living in her own reality. So anything that I would say, she wouldn't care. She would probably just use it against me even more if I did say anything. So, and then I also felt she would expect an apology. And I was not going to apologize for, one, having a voice after months of being called out numerous times, like specifically called out by name, of being accused, and now of finally being a black woman. So I did not meet her. I didn't want to meet with her because I would not meet her expectations. So what point, like, I felt like, what point would it be to have another useless meeting and have her spend my energy and my time on her. And then I was told that the way that they were meeting the director, her report to, and the executive director, who happens to also be my report to, and also the director, her report to, the Asian woman's direct report to, they were planning to meet with the Asian woman directly to see what her needs were. And that's what I was told. They were going to meet with her to see what her needs were. After I had made the statement that that's racism and that's racial profiling, and that is a fraudulent claim. But they were going to meet with the Asian woman to see what her needs are. Over the next month, the executive director and the director had numerous conversations with the Asian woman to address her needs and her requests. Never was racism brought to the forefront in any of these meetings. They never made her aware that her claim was racist. It's racial discrimination. It's racial bias. It is harassment, and it is fraudulent. Never once was that brought to her in any of these meetings. All the meetings were specifically, and it was numerous meetings, and they were all specifically to talk about her needs and her requests, and if they can fulfill her requests. And these meetings continued. These meetings continued directly with the Asian woman, even after I had conversations, separate conversations, like just in general conversations about directly with the executive director. Again, he oversees all employees, including me, and her director. And never once was the Asian woman reprimanded for her racist comments or behavior. Never once did the executive director schedule a meeting directly with me to speak specifically about the incident or to address my claim of racism. Never once was there any separate meetings. Every time that we spoke about it, meaning myself with the executive director, every time we spoke about it, it was just like in passing type of thing. It was like in another meeting and it just comes up. And it's just touched briefly on it. But never once was I asked, what was my needs, or how could they support, how could the organization support me, or how can the executive director, support me? Never once. Never once was my claim of racism addressed either. Although numerous meetings were intentionally scheduled with the Asian woman to discuss her needs, I was never asked what I needed as a Black woman to support me, who just experienced occupational oppression. Never once was I asked, what support do I need? I never once received the same options or concessions as the Asian woman who blatantly and openly displayed racial bias and racial discrimination. And they, meaning the organization, continue to allow her to do so. I just want to give keywords. I know I don't have a nice fancy little slide like the other ones, but I want to go over, I have two words on the screen, and it's two keyword terms. Racial bias and racial discrimination. So racial bias, the definition, I just want to give the quick definitions about this. Racial bias is a form of implicit biases, which refers to the attitudes or the stereotypes that affect an individual's understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Can't say that hers was unconscious, but racial discrimination involves treating someone, an applicant or employee, unfavorably because he or she is of a certain race, or because of personal characteristics associated with race, such as hair, texture, skin color, or certain facial features. Color discrimination involves treating someone unfairly because of their skin color complexion. So those are two key terms, racial bias and racial discrimination. And those are both things that I had just experienced. Almost 2 months after her complaint, I found myself approaching the modern day lynching tree. The executive director totally blindsided me. The executive director shared with me that the Asian woman went to the board of directors to file an official complaint with the board of directors a couple of weeks before he had told me this. And that the board chairs had spoken to the executive director, the Asian woman, and even the director, who's her report to, the Asian woman's report to, that they have spoken to him all separately over the course of the past couple of weeks. And now the board wanted to speak with me. And that is the only reason why he was bringing it to my attention, is because the board wanted to speak to me. And at this moment, I was so confused. Why am I approaching a lynching tree right now? I remember thinking to myself, wait a minute. She filed an official complaint about me directly to the board over 2 weeks ago, an erroneous, fraudulent claim at that. And everybody knew, the executive director knew, the director knew that it was a fraudulent claim. But she was able to file an official complaint about me directly to the board over 2 weeks ago, an erroneous, fraudulent claim at that. And the board has been interviewing. They have been investigating and interviewing. They started an investigation process and interviewing process with other people in private, and I'm just now being notified of it 2 weeks after the fact. And only because now the board chairs want to meet with me. And I'm just going to be transparent and honest. I was angry. At that moment, I was angry because not once did I receive the same concessions and support as this Asian woman. Not once did I receive the same options. This was a racist attack against me. And I was the only one being dehumanized. And the thing about it, the executive director downplayed the whole situation. He downplayed the whole situation. He even told me this. I don't want you to think that you're in trouble. You're not in trouble. So I don't want you to think that you're not in trouble. They just want to talk. And this is coming from a man who has the option to take advantage of white privilege and white superiority and white supremacy at the drop of a dime. He didn't even realize the white superiority breathing that lived inside that comment. You are not in trouble. You're not in trouble. He didn't even realize that. How does a grown professional adult think it's okay to make comments to another adult as if they're a child, they're a kid? A grown professional adult that isn't aware of white superiority and white supremacy, that's how. And I want to also point out that during my meeting with the board chairs, one of the board chairs had the audacity to make the same comment, "You're not in trouble," the same comment after I had to bring to their attention how wrong this was, and I had to bring racism into it. And she's still, the board chair, had the audacity to still make that comment. I just have an illustration. What is white superiority? And I have an illustration on my screen here. But what the illustration says is a picture of a drawing of a white man in I don't know, it looks almost like in a vest and a hat, baseball hat or something. But it says, "White men built this nation. White men are this nation." And I felt like that explained what white superiority is. So I was never asked if I ever wanted to have a conversation. I wasn't given a choice. I wasn't asked if I needed any support. I wasn't asked, what do you need? What do you need, Alicia? I wasn't given that validation or the confirmation that this is wrong. And that as an organization from staff to board, we need to be better and do better. My claim of racism was never investigated or mentioned. But the Asian woman's erroneous fraudulent claim was addressed organization-wide from the executive director to the board. And this is where I found myself at the base of the lynching tree. This is where I found it. I remember waking up in the early hours the next morning. And this was the morning where I knew that this was the day that I knew that I possibly would have a meeting scheduled with the board chairs about her erroneous fraudulent claim. And I remember waking up in that morning in the early hours with a heavy burden surrounding my spirit. The burden was so heavy that while I was praying, all I could do was cry. I just never felt that way before with a burden. All I could do was cry. I had no words, and all I could do was cry, and all I could do is just say the Lord's Prayer over and over and over continuously. I don't even know how many times I said it as I was crying. And I asked God to eventually I asked God to please have mercy on me. That's all I can say. Just please have mercy on me. It almost felt as if I felt it. The it, right? I felt it. The dread, right? I felt it. I felt the dread. I felt it was coming for me deep in my spirit. I felt it coming for me deep in my spirit that day. And I felt like the same. I felt like this is the same as for my ancestors, right? Feeling the looming feeling of oppression deep within their spirit. A day where your spirit, my spirit, the day where you knew that you would be powerless. You would be powerless. So this is the day that I found myself at the base of the lynching tree. And after I prayed, I began to understand why the burden was so heavy. Why the burden was so heavy. And as a black woman, I don't have, let me just point out, as black women, like I don't have the same privileges as the majority that share the same exact spaces with me, right? Even board level, down to the staff level, down to the leadership level. Like I don't have the same privileges in that space as the majority. I don't have the privilege to have an equitable voice. And when I decide to speak as a black woman, I need to be mindful. I need to always be mindful of my body language or my voice level. Because see, once I speak out, once I share my feelings, I am immediately racially profiled as the angry, aggressive black woman who create a hostile environment. And the only time I spoke up, I experienced racial bias, racial discrimination, and no one addressed it. No one addressed it. The executive director didn't address it, and the board chairs didn't address it. No one addressed it, and no one was aware of its implications. The Asian woman had the privilege to go directly to the board chairs to file an erroneous fraudulent complaint against me. Not against anyone else in that room. Not even the frustrated white man. She had a choice. The Asian woman had a choice to go to the board. And in doing so, the board chairs, even after being told by others during the interviewing and investigation process, others had said it was racism, that it was racist. But even the board chairs still wanted to meet with me to tell them what happened on that day in that meeting. For me to explain my actions, my words. After months, and this is after months of attacks and the last few months of being racially attacked, I wasn't invited to sit at the table with the board chairs. No, I wasn't invited to sit at the table. I was being called to sit at the table by two white people in a position of power and white superiority, which these are the same two people, or at least one of the people, the board chairs, who I share the same space with for meetings at least once or twice a week. right? I wasn't called to sit at the table for racial reconciliation or for confirmation of the microaggressions that I've experienced for the past 5 months. Microaggressions that I've experienced for 5 months. I wasn't called to sit at the table as an ally. I wasn't called to sit at the table as an ally. I was called to sit at the table as the accused, the inferior being. That's what I was being called to the table as, on a fraudulent claim. And see, this is the moment. Meeting with the board chairs about this, on all of that foundation right there. This is the moment at the modern day lynching tree that I dropped to my knees. This is the point where I was stripped of all of my power. I had no power. I was powerless. I was sitting at the table stripped of all my power by white superiority and white supremacy, all by the hands of a racist. I was at the point where I was stripped away of my dignity and humanity. I sat there as a black woman being wrongfully accused. And what I had to do is I had to sacrifice my whole inner being. I had to expose the depths of my soul at the cost of explaining to 2 white people how and why this is wrong. Having to explain to them how racism just showed up and given all the power throughout this organization. This particular moment was the most racially traumatic experience and most humiliating experience in my adult life. It felt like I was emotionally stripped of any power. I was powerless. I was inferior. It was the most degrading and dehumanizing experience as a black person and as a woman, black woman. I remember telling my husband while in tears straight after that meeting, Why did I have to sacrifice and expose my whole inner being? Why did I have to be at my most vulnerable, weakest state, just to make them woke? And see, the most interesting part of this record right now is that the organization actively implements advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion organizational wide, meaning from the staff to the board. They're trying to advance it. They're trying to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion within the organization, from the staff all the way to the board. And as the only black person, the only black woman in senior leadership, I sit on all DEI committees. Right? Tokenism. I didn't have a definition for that, but my second record to come, my update, definitely will cover that. Tokenism. But I sit on all DEI committee boards. I'm the face. That's a sign of tokenism, right? But if you think about it, how are we advancing DEI? How are we advancing DEI in the organization where there is the ugliness and the filthiness and the disgustingness of racism, of white superiority, of white supremacy, and occupational oppression flowing fluidly within the organization? How can you advance diversity, equity, and inclusion? How can you do that? In closing, but I already know, because I'm still currently going through it with the organization and with the Asian coworker, the Asian woman. But in closing, my time at the modern day lynching tree isn't over. I have more records to record about this experience. Currently, I am still on my knees in front of the lynching tree, the modern day lynching tree, trying my hardest to regain my power, to regain my strength to fight. to fight for what is just and right. And I can't help but think, how? How do I fight? How do I fight? How do I regain my power? How do I not allow for the most racially traumatic experience to break me mentally and emotionally? How do I not allow that? So we are at the end of my record. That was a lot to unpack, and I'm glad that I was able to share this time in this space, and I'm glad that you decided to share this time in this space with me. Like I said, I am currently still at the modern day lynching tree with this organization and this particular employee. So I will definitely have more records, more updates. I plan to record my complete journey, so others can be informed, especially women of color, Black women. So what I want to do is at this moment just encourage you to follow my Facebook page, Alicia F. Griffin, to read my latest journal records about this journey, to stay on top of it. Also, I love open conversations. I absolutely love open conversations, basically interfaith dialogue. So please, I ask that you please share my records. The more awareness and support that we can put out there, the better. Correct. So I would, love it if you can share my records or comment below or on my Facebook page. Like I said again, I love open conversations, the interfaith dialogue. One thing I just want to point out is to please also follow me on my podcast, Spiritual Tea Podcast. Spiritual Tea Podcast we have a page on Facebook. We're also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can technically even say, Alexa, please play Spiritual Tea Podcast, and she will play it for you. So yes, I have the name. I have the name and the website address of a Spiritual Tea Podcast right here, so you can see it. And again, this has been this is a journey, and it's a hard journey, but we will get through it. Thank you.